Yes, she answered quietly. It must be told. Everything was to be done quickly, for fear of unwanted intruders happening upon the great house of the Matarese, and the death that was everywhere. The guests gathered their papers and fled to their rooms. I remained in the shadows of the balcony, my body filled with pain, the silent vomit of fear all around me. How long I stayed there I could not tell, but soon I heard the running feet of the guests racing down the staircase to the appointed meeting place. There, there, was the sound of carriage wheels and the neighing of horses. Minutes later, a carriage sped away, hoofs clattering on the hard stone, with the rapid cracking of a whip, all fading away quickly. I started to crawl towards the balcony door, not able to think, my eyes filled with bolts of lightning, my head trembling so I could barely find my way. I pressed my hands on the wall, wishing there were brackets I could hold on to. When I heard a shout and threw myself to the floor again. It was a terrible shout, for it came from a child, and yet it was cold and demanding. Benicivito, the shepherd boy, was screaming at someone from the north veranda. If all was senseless up to that moment, the child's shouts intensified, the madness beyond any understandings, for he was a child and a killer. Somehow I rose to my feet and ran through the door at the top of the staircase. I was about to run down, wanting only to get away into the air and the fields that and the protection of darkness, when I heard other shouts and saw the figures of running men through the shadows. They were carrying torches and in seconds crashed through the doors. I could not run down for I would be seen, so I ran above to the upper house, my panic such that I no longer knew what I was doing, only running, running. And as if guided by an unseen hand that wanted me to live, I burst into the sewing room and saw the dead. There they were, sprawled everywhere in blood, mouths stretched in such terror I could still hear their screams. The screams I heard were not real, but the shouts of the men on the staircase were. It was the end for me. There was nothing left. I was to be caught. I would be killed. And then, as suddenly as an unseen hand had led me to that room, it forced me to do a most terrible thing. I joined the dead. I put my hands in the blood of my sisters and rubbed it all over my face and clothes. I fell on top of my sisters and waited. The men came into the sewing room, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers, but none deterred from the work they had to do. The next hours were a nightmare only the devil could conceive of. The bodies of my sisters and I were carried down the staircase and hurled through the doors beyond the marble steps into the drive. Wagons had been brought from the stables, and by now many were filled with bodies. Again, my sisters and I were thrown into the back of a cart, crowded with dead, like so much refuse. The stench of waste and blood was so overpowering, I had to sink my teeth into my own flesh to keep from screaming. Though the corpses above me, Through the corpses above me and over the railings, I could hear men shouting orders. Nothing could be stolen from the Villa Matrice. Anyone found doing so would join the bodies inside, for there were to be many bodies left inside, charred flesh and bones to be found at a later time. The wagons began to move, smoothly at first when we reached the fields, and the horses were whipped unmercifully. The wagons raced through the grass and over the rocks, at immense speeds, as if every second was a second our living guards wished to leave behind in hell. There was death below me, death above me, and I prayed to Almighty God to take me also. But I could not cry out, for although I wanted to die, I was afraid of the pain of dying. The unseen hand held me by the throat, but mercy was granted me. I fell into unconsciousness. How long, I do not know, but I think it was a very long time. I awakened. The wagons had come to a stop. and I peered through the bodies of the slats in the sides. There was moonlight, and we were far up in the wooded hills, but not in the mountains. Nothing was familiar to me. We were far, far away from gloomy trees, but where I could not tell you then, and cannot tell you now. The last of the nightmare began. Our bodies were pulled off the wagons and thrown into a common grave, each corpse held by two men so that they could hurl it into the deepest part. I fell in pain, my teeth sinking into my finger to keep my mind from crossing into madness. I opened my eyes, and the vomit came again, at what I saw all around me: dead faces, limp arms, gaping mouths, stabbed, bleeding carcasses that only hours ago had been human beings. The grave was enormous, wide and deep, and strangely, it seemed to me, in my silent hysteria, shaped in the form of a circle. Beyond the edge, I would hear the voices of our grave diggers. Some were weeping, others cried out to Christ for mercy. Several were demanding that the blessed sacraments be given to the dead, that for the sake of all their souls, a priest be brought to the place of death and intercede with God. But other men said no. They were not the killers, merely those chosen to put the slain to rest. God would understand. Basta, they said. It could not be done. It was the price they paid for the good of generations yet to be born. The hills were theirs, the fields and streams and forests belonged to them. There was no turning back now. They had made their pact with the padrone, and he had made it clear to the elders. Only the government's knowledge of a conspirazione would take the lands from them. The padrone was the most learned of men. He knew the courts and the laws. His ignorant tenants did not. They were to do exactly as he had instructed the elders, or the high courts would take the lands from them. There could be no priests from Porto Vecchio or St. Lucie or anywhere else. The chance taken that word would go out of the hills. Those who had other thoughts could join the dead. Their secret was never to leave the hills. The lands were theirs. It was enough. The men fell silent, picked up their shovels, and began throwing dirt over the bodies. I thought then that surely I would die, my mouth and nostrils smothered under the earth. Yet I think all of us trapped with death find ways to elude its touch. Ways we could never dream of before we are caught. It happened for me. As each layer of earth filled the circular grave, acorns, and was trampled upon, I moved my hands in the darkness, clawing the dirt above me so that I could breathe. At the very end, I had nothing but the smallest passage of air, but it was enough. There was space around my head, enough for God's air to invade. The unseen hand had guided mine, and I lived. It was hours later, I believe, when I began to burrow my way to the surface, a blind, unknowing animal seeking life. When my hand reached through to nothing but cold, moist air, I wept without control, and a part of my brain went into panic, frightened that my weeping would be heard. God was merciful. Everyone had left. I crawled out of the earth, and I walked out of that forest of death into a field and saw the early morning sunlight rising over the mountain. I was alive, but there was no life for me. I could not go back to the hills, for surely I would be killed. And yet, to go elsewhere, to arrive at some strange place and simply be, was not possible for a young woman in this island country. There was no one I could turn to. Having spent 3 years a willing captive of my padrone, yet I could not simply die in that field with God's sunlight spreading over the sky. It told me to leave, you see. I tried to think what I might do, where I might go, beyond the hills, on the ocean's coast, where other great houses that belonged to other padrones, friends of Guillerme. I wondered what would happen were I to appear at one of them and plead for shelter and mercy. Then I saw the error of such thinking. Those men were not my padrone. They were the men with wives and families, and I was the whore of the Matarese. While Guillerme was alive, my presence was to be tolerated, even enjoyed, for the great man would have it no other way. But with him dead, I was done. Then I remembered there was a man who tended the stables of an estate in Zonza. He had been kind to me during those times we visited, and I rode his employer's mounts. He had smiled often and guided me as to my proper deportment in the saddle, for he saw that I was not born to the hunt. Indeed, I admitted it, and we had talked and laughed together. And each time I had seen the look in his eyes, I was used to glances of desire, but his eyes held more than that. There was a gentleness and understanding, perhaps even respect, not for what I was, but for what I did not pretend to be. I looked at the early sun, and I knew that Zonza was on my left, probably beyond the mountains. I set out for those stables and that man. He became my husband, and although I bore the child of Guillerme de Matrice, he accepted her as his own, giving us both love and protection through the days of his life. Those years and our lives during those years are no concern of yours. They do not pertain to the padrone. It is enough to say that no harm came to us. For years we lived far north in Vescovado, away from the danger of the hill people, never daring to mention their secret. The dead could not be brought back, you see, and the killer and his killer's son, the man and the shepherd boy, had fled Corsica. I have told you the truth, all of it. If you still have doubts, I cannot put them to rest. Again, she had finished.